The first thing I did was pull the child back. We were at the foot of an escalator, about to go up, and people were coming the other way. Not running, but coming out, more of them than made sense. And over it all, an alarm was sounding somewhere in the building. I hadn't seen smoke. I hadn't seen fire. Neither had the child, which was exactly the problem. No smoke, no fire. So why should we leave? The child pulled forward. I pulled back. The child won, the way children do, and we rode up into a floor where even more people were moving toward the escalators, and at that point, I stopped negotiating. I pulled the child toward the escalator going down. I remember there was something of flight in it, in the way I was moving, in the way I was holding on. We came out, crossed the road, and stopped on the far pavement, because the child would go no further, and because a good number of other people had stopped there too. I put both hands on the child's shoulders, and then I went to work. I was looking at the intersections, one after another. Which way we would go if fire showed at a window? Which street was widest? Which corner might jam with people if everyone moved at once? I was afraid of smoke appearing suddenly with nowhere to run. I was afraid of a turning that ended in a wall. I was afraid, very specifically, of the child going down in a crowd. My hands stayed where they were, locked, while my eyes did this. From across the road, I would have looked like a man standing still. I was measuring distances. The building gave me nothing to measure against. I went over its face, floor by floor, looking for smoke, for a flicker behind glass, for anything wrong. What I found was glass, signage, sun on the upper windows. A weekend afternoon sitting on that building, the way it sat on every other building in the street. The alarm was one sound. The normal was 1,000 details, and the details kept arriving. At some point, my hands eased a little on the child's shoulders. I didn't decide that. I only know it happened. Some people had walked off. More hadn't. They stood in loose knots at what felt like an agreed distance, facing the building, and the way they stood, there is no better way to say it, was as if they were waiting to see when the fire would start. Nobody seemed to be asking whether they should be further away. And in that stillness, my own urgency began to feel oversized. The arithmetic I had been doing on the intersections started to seem like something from a different, more dramatic afternoon. I felt it as a kind of embarrassment, quiet, low in the chest, the feeling of being the only one in costume. I later realized that somewhere in there I had begun to think about the time before. An alarm that had gone off and come to nothing, and to wonder, looking at all the people who weren't leaving, whether that was what kept them there. I want to be honest about this part. I never asked anyone. It was a guess, and the guess was doing a job, though I couldn't have said so at the time. It was borrowing an old false alarm and lending it to this one. Then the sirens arrived, the real ones, mechanical, getting louder, and my hands tightened again, both of them on the child's shoulders, with a small pull inward toward me. The engines came in fast and stopped hard. Firefighters swung down in full kit and went toward the building, checking as they went, left and right, the way you check a thing you have checked many times before. The crowd quietened a notch, necks stretched, the shorter ones rose on tiptoe. Someone arriving late asked what was going on, and someone else passed along the little that was known. Heads turned together, following the helmets. Mine did too. The longer I watched, the clearer it became that the people closest to the danger were the calmest people in the street. I don't know when it happened, but at some point I was holding the child with one hand, resting on one shoulder, and the other hand was at my side. I wasn't measuring distances anymore. Later I went looking for a city where warnings had sounded, and people still set them aside. I ended up in Chicago in October of 1871. According to the records of that night, the city had already had its fire, the evening before, a Saturday. That one was real. It burned through the night, and by the time it was out, the fire crews were spent and some of their equipment was damaged. Then came Sunday evening, and bells again. And here is the part I had gone looking for. Most of the people who heard those bells took no particular notice. It had been a dry season. There had been fires all month. Bells were not news. Many assumed this was yesterday's fire, some remnant of it flaring up, being dealt with. And there were arrangements for dealing with it. A watchman up in the courthouse tower whose job was to see, alarm boxes on the street corners whose job was to tell. The seeing and the telling belonged to somebody, so people stayed where they were. They heard the bells and went back into their Sunday evening, back to the table, back to the room, back to whatever the evening had been before the sound passed through it. The histories of that fire are mostly about what happened afterwards, but I kept stopping at this earlier hour instead. The hour when the warning was still just a sound that a person could weigh and discount and set down. I recognized the posture. I had stood in it myself that weekend. One hand on a child's shoulder, across the street from a building that turned out not to be burning. The all clear came, or rather the building simply began taking people back, and that was the all clear. The crowd that had drained out now flowed in again, faster, it seemed, than it had left. The child came away, delighted with the whole event, sure we had been lucky. And in every way that mattered to the child, we had. Inside, you could see what an alarm does to a building. Shops standing open that nobody had managed to close, and in the food court, table after table of half-eaten meals, exactly where they had been left. Some people came back relieved. Some of the vendors looked deflated. Food cooked and never paid for, customers gone halfway through a plate. Within minutes, it was an ordinary weekend again, so completely that you could have doubted the last hour had happened. We didn't find out that day what had set the alarm off. The news explained it that evening. Then, on another day, we were in the fried chicken place we always go to. Halfway through the meal, fire engines went past outside, sirens up, the sound swelling and then dropping away down the road. The children went quiet. And then, from across the table, how did people put out fires in the old days? Was there really a city that burned down once? I didn't answer. What came to me instead, while the sirens faded, was the food court that afternoon. All those half-finished meals waiting on the tables, and how quickly the people came back to sit down and finish them,